I want to continue on covering this major story. Once again, putting up this tweet from the U.S. Coast Guard in the Northeast talking about a debris field that was discovered within the search area near that Titanic. As the tour taking place, experts within the Unified Command are evaluating the information. And right now, we want to continue covering this. We're going to be joined right now by Dr. Rob Sanders. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. As a retired JAG captain, a lot of work you've done with both government and commercial submersibles, submarines. When you hear the term debris field near a search area, does that kind of point to the fact that they might have found something? What are they mentioning when they talk about the debris field?
Well, it could be anything, but in this case, the worst case scenario would be external components or a large piece of the shell of the submersible. That would be the worst case scenario, which indicated that maybe the vessel had imploded, which unfortunately would cause a very quick death to all on board. But remember, this is Titanic, and all around the Titanic are Titanic debris fields, things that have been there since that ship went down, pieces of the ship that come loose and fall off over time, pieces of the ship that came off as it originally sank. And you can distinguish the old from the new based on old brass would have turned green by now, old metal would have been rusted, and all of it will be covered in barnacles or other type of sea sediment and debris. New materials, modern day materials, this vessel was made of carbon fiber, would be distinguishable from those Titanic debris. The external instruments that hung off of the side of the ship, the submersible, its power, its lights, all of the things that were not not ancient, but are modern day, would be distinguishable from Titanic wreckage and debris.
Yeah.
So whatever they found in that debris field is going to be critical to determine whether or not this is actually potentially the submersible or something else.
Correct. And then they haven't really linked the two yet, the debris field to this missing sub as of yet, and they have to piece that together very, very closely. But obviously there is debris in the ocean. The ocean is a very vast entity. Maybe how many debris fields, and maybe what are they looking for? When they look for this debris field, maybe what stands out in a debris field that they're looking for in this regard?
Well, they're going to look for modern materials. So this submersible was carbon fiber. The Titanic was steel. Very distinguishable different things on the bottom. The engines of the Titanic we would not see because they're inside the ship, inside the hull. But an engine from this particular submersible, they were external to it. So you would be able to see them. They would be either attached or detached, depending on what happened to this vessel, if in fact it was a catastrophic loss. We're all hoping that it wasn't, and that there's still time to rescue these folks. Although we've got to remember we're 2 miles plus down, and we haven't done a rescue like that ever before.
Correct. Yeah, and you mentioned just the depth in which this rescue potentially is taking place. Are they looking to recover this debris field or just maybe take pictures of it? Because they mentioned maybe some robotic of these submersibles going down there, so they don't know if they have that kind of capability. Are they looking just to look at this debris field, or are they looking to potentially recover it as well?
Well, the start is to look at it, to determine what it is and if it is what we hope it is not, the actual submersible. The recovery is a whole other story. If it was an active U.S. military vessel, we would consider that site to be a grave, and it would be protected by federal law. And then the government may recover it or not recover it based on certain things. For instance, when an F-35 went down in the waters, we recovered that because to leave it down there and have it recovered by an adversary would risk certain sensitive equipment, as well as trying to recover the crew. Same thing happened with U.S. military Navy helicopters that have gone down in the water. This is a private vessel. This is a private excursion. Whether or not the private industry, the insurance company or et cetera, try to recover it is one thing. A secondary thing is whether the U.S. government would foot the bill to do so itself. That's a separate determination by different folks at civilian and military pay grades.
Of course, of course. And up on our screen constantly right now is that U.S. Coast Guard out of Boston as we await that press conference. But we're still talking Dr. Rob Sanders, retired JAG captain, U.S. Navy, spent a lot of time there. But we also mentioned, you talked about more than 100 hours since this vessel went missing on Sunday. Maybe how does the search change from this point forward, knowing that they might be out of oxygen? Obviously, it was a desperate search leading up. But does the search effort change at all? Obviously, the debris field also changing things, but does it change moving forward knowing that they potentially are out of oxygen?
Well, at some point, the on-site commander for the Coast Guard will speak with his superiors, and they'll make a determination of whether this is still a rescue mission or it's a recovery mission. If it's a recovery mission, the presumption is that all have been lost, and now it's an effort to recover what could be recovered. Again, we're 2 miles down. Plus, what can be recovered, how it can be recovered. There are certain vessels that can dive that deep, but there aren't that many in the world. And the ability to use them to do this, of course, is also another outside of the realm of the government. If it's not a government vessel, it's a private vessel, and the private vessel has to be engaged to do such.
Correct. And I want to go back to the debris field because we've talked to other people about just this vessel in particular and the safety measures that they have on them if something does go wrong, something like a balloon or different things at the surface. Could that be what the debris field is? Could it be maybe a potential balloon that inflated to try to bring them back up? Could that be a part of the debris field as well?
Well, what I understood about this particular vessel is some of those safety measures didn't exist. So, for instance, you had a failure in certain manner. Maybe you start to dive too deeply, and the angle of dive or the speed of dive would trigger safety measures, and that might launch a locating device which would float to the surface and then give off a radio signal, and also would probably have a strobe light on it so you could see it. My understanding is this vessel didn't have that, so that's problematic. The vessel itself, when the vessel was closed up, my understanding is that the hatch, it doesn't open manually from the inside, that they were actually bolted in. So you would have to have a mechanism to unbolt them to get them out. Even if they were bobbing on the surface, you would still have to have some type of process to do that. If you think back about recovery of U.S. spacecraft when they landed in the ocean, one of the things that they had to do was to put a flotation device around them, so when they opened the hatch, they weren't swamped and sunk. We actually did have one of those happen, and it was a dangerous event for our astronauts at the time. So, anything on the surface of the water or under the water, this is not a natural environment for man. This is nature's domain, and nature's in control. And we go in it at our peril.
Yeah, and you mentioned the safety protocols and what this vessel may or may not have had. You've spent quite a bit of time, I imagine, in submersibles, in submarines for both the government and for commercial entities. Maybe talk a little bit about the safety protocols that go into place when you're looking at something, going down to these sort of depths. Maybe how much of a priority is that safety when you're looking into this?
Safety is always a priority. Safety is your number one priority. And to be safe is one thing. To be safer is another thing. You can never be safe. You can be safer, which means that you build into your systems redundancies that help you have a loss of one particular system and another one can take over. I don't think this vessel had as many of those redundancies because they were trying to cut expenses and not, for instance, have a navigation device that was not a game controller. Those type of things say some things about the potential safety built into it. I also heard, unverified, that when the vessel was delivered, it was supposed to be 7 inches of carbon thick hull, and it was only 5. If that's the case, and they accepted it, then they accepted a higher risk of damage or accident based on a thinner hull. The thickness of the hull determines the pressure that vessel is able to undertake. And every time you dive down, you stress the hull. So how many times can you stress a 5-inch carbon fiber hull at certain depths versus a 7-inch carbon fiber hull at certain depths?
Yeah.
Don't know the answers to those, but those are questions that engineers and other folks in the industry are going to be asking themselves and each other as we look back on this and try to reconstruct it.
Correct. And you mentioned just maybe the strength of the vessel itself and the carbon fiber nature versus 7 versus 5 inches. Can you talk a little bit just about the pressure of the ocean? Because as you go down, certainly the pressure increases, but it's increasing exponentially and in certain ways. Can you just talk about how far down the pressure is, and just talk about the pressure of the ocean? Because I think that just whole entity is certainly surprising, because as you go further down, the pressure continues to build significantly, correct?
Right. I believe somewhere around 35,000 pounds of pressure was what was at the bottom of the ocean where the Titanic is. No human being could withstand that, and it would take a vessel, and there's only about a dozen of them in the world, that can do that and sustain and survive that pressure. This was supposedly one of those vessels. It had done it a couple of times, but it was substantially different from the other vessels. And one of the other things that has come to light from other experts is that there was a regulatory scheme within the other vessels, or at least that the other vessels had complied with, that they thought for scientific purposes, this is what they needed to have as their submersible specifications. This particular submersible didn't have those same specs, and it was considered to be experimental in that aspect and not proven and tested like some of these other vessels have been. That also goes back to that point of safe versus safer.
Yeah.
Never safe, but you can be safer.
Correct. Yeah, that is a very good point. And those 5 people aboard this vessel that went down to tour the Titanic certainly didn't have a ton of experience. They did have experience potentially going down to this. Can you just talk a little bit about what it's like to go down to, maybe not this depth, but to go down to significant depths in the ocean? Because I imagine you have experienced that before.
I've been down to some depths in the ocean in U.S. Navy Trident submarines on a number of occasions. It's a very different experience. On the surface, the submarine moves like a fish. It goes up and down through the water in a fish-like manner. That's why you often see dolphins chasing the submarines. A very exciting thing to see. But once it goes under the surface, it dives, and of course, it dives as you would expect, angularly, depending how fast it dives, depending on the steepness of the angle. Ideally, you're not diving fast, you're diving slow because you're not in an emergency situation. And that allows the pressure to build slowly. If you dive really fast, that means the pressure is going to build exponentially faster, depending on the angle of the dive and the depth of the dive. The same thing reverses on the way up. The pressure comes off at some, depending on the angle of the dive. And all of those things stress the hulls. Now, in a Navy submarine, there's double hulls. There's 2 hulls. There's an inner hull and an outer hull, and those are safety measures that a Navy submarine has. And oh, by the way, those U.S. Navy submarines, as sophisticated and as durable and as dynamic as they are, can't go this deep.
Yeah, of course. Dr. Rob Sanders, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I want to continue to talk with you, but I do want to put up just a little bit of information that we're learning here as I chat with you. Again, a live look there in Boston, Massachusetts, as a press conference from the U.S. Coast Guard going to be happening momentarily. But I do want to post a statement from Ocean Gate as we're learning new information on this. And this is a statement that just came across our desk that says, "We now believe that our CEO Stockton Rush and the others have sadly been lost." So this is new information that we're getting just ahead of this press conference, certainly as they continue to grieve the loss of those 5 people past the 5-day mark here. So this is the statement there on Live Now from Fox. I'm going to continue just to talk about this as we talk with Rob Sanders, amongst other people here on Live Now from Fox. Certainly a big story from this day here on Live Now from Fox, but certainly OceanGate saying this. Rob, stay with me just for a little bit here on Live Now from Fox as we continue to cover this major story. But OceanGate now saying they believe they have lost these 5 souls on this vessel that vanished as it was touring the Titanic. It was reported lost on Sunday. This is a statement again from OceanGate, as they believe the CEO and those 4 others have sadly been lost as they were touring the Titanic. Of course, we're expecting to hear from the U.S. Coast Guard as they had about 96 hours of oxygen. We just learned earlier today also a debris field was found near the search site of where this Titan submersible. We talked a lot about this, but they believe the passengers have been lost. Certainly a tragic story, a tragic ending to this story that we followed here on Live Now from Fox. We want to continue on. Dr. Rob Sanders, thank you so much again. Obviously, we just heard this news. Kind of, what is your initial reaction? Obviously, maybe not of surprise, but certainly sadness to hear that this is the case in this story.
It's certainly sadness. It's always a sad day when we lose explorers trying to take our knowledge of our known and unknown forward. I had heard, actually, before I came on the show with you, that there had been some preliminary identification of the debris field that indicated that components of the submersible were in that debris field. I didn't want to prejudge that or make an announcement on that, but now that it's been brought forward by the OceanGate staff itself, there were probably parts of the submersible that were readily identifiable, that were able to be seen, and once they were seen in that debris field and it's clearly distinguishable from Titanic and clearly identifiable as the OceanGate craft, you could determine whether or not there had been survivors.
Correct. Yeah.
At that depth, a human outside of that vessel couldn't survive.
Yeah, and we talked about certainly a sad moment, as they say. They have been lost. This from the OceanGate Incorporated there as we're just learning this information. But like you said, it would be easily distinguishable from something from the Titanic versus this material, just based on the modern nature of it as we continue on. But you also mentioned just potentially just the safe versus safer. What potentially could have gone wrong with this and the ultimate fate that these 5 souls had?
Well, there's a litany of things that couldn't have gone wrong. You know, the first thing that I think of is one of the things that you think about an aircraft, which is applicable to submarines. You fly a plane in a certain amount of time in a certain way, and over time the metal becomes stressed. And based on that stressing of the metal, the plane becomes no longer flight worthy. Well, the same thing can happen to a submarine. You take it down, you pressurize the metal, the carbon fiber hull. Over time, there are weaknesses in the carbon fiber hull from the pressure begin to appear, not to the naked eye, but to the investigators. The United States Navy will take a ship, a submarine, and put it in dry dock, and they'll x-ray. They'll actually look at the vessel's hull to determine whether there's stress on it. The same thing happens with airplanes after a certain amount of time. If an airplane makes a certain maneuver, they'll have to look at it to make sure that it is still airworthy. Same thing happens with seaworthy.
Of course. Yeah, Dr. Rob Sanders, thank you again for joining us. We just see stepping up to the podium the U.S. Coast Guard. Let's listen into this live here on Live Now from Fox. Thank you so much for your insight. Let's listen into what they have to say here out of Boston, Massachusetts.